When I imagine this story in my mind, I imagine the devil with his arm around a famished Christ, out somewhere in a wild and barren land. "I could save you a whole lot of trouble," he whispers. "You're too good for a life like this. You're too powerful. Why starve yourself with fasting? Make these stones into bread." I imagine him whispering, "Why are you content telling people to have faith? Prove God's power to them. Right here, jump off and survive." Why are you content to suffer and die and toil in obscurity among the poor and the sick? You could be a king. Think of all the good you could do for them then. Just bow down, worship me, and I will give you dominion over all of this. Of course, we've come a long way since when that story was written, right? We've come a long way from those old superstitions, the devils and the demons and the curses and things like that. We've got better explanations now. A psychologist might tell us that all this talk of devils is just a nod to the violence and malice that lives somewhere deep within us, the Jungian shadow. There is anthropologists who could tell us how societies have a tendency to personify evil to help them explain how bad things could happen to good people. A good biblical scholar could tell you that the word that's translated as devil in Greek, it really just means adversary, and it might be intended as a more general term. And certainly any theologian worth their salt would tell you that God alone has power over this world. Incidentally, I would put myself in those camps. I've never been much into Satan. Not just as an object of my own devotion, but I've never been much into the idea of the devil. It's a part of the Bible that I admit I sometimes sort of gloss over or I explain away with one of those metaphors. There was a French poet and essayist named Charles Pierre Baudelaire, 19th century. He once wrote, "My dear brethren, don't ever forget when you hear the progress of people praised, that the loveliest trick of the devil is to persuade you that he does not exist." You might know that line better in the voice of Kevin Spacey's character from The Usual Suspects, telling an FBI agent who's interrogating him, the greatest trick the devil ever played was convincing the world he didn't exist. So I sat down to write a sermon about the devil, and I remembered that I had never much been a fan of the devil. And I thought, what metaphor might there be in this story? But then I couldn't help but wonder if I'd been tricked. So I decided that for this year's sermon about the devil, this is actually the first text that I have preached on for a second time in this church. It's kind of a milestone. I've come back around. Last year, I played with it as a metaphor, as an image. But this year, I was wondering if maybe I'd been tricked. So I sat there wondering if we have accepted at our own peril the idea that the only organized force in the universe is a good one, and all the bad that we see and encounter is just little accidents along the way, the sum of little sins. Now, as I delve deeper into my musing here, I do want to pause to be clear. I see no evidence in our tradition that would support a belief in a personified entity with horns and a pitchfork reeking of sulfur and wandering around meddling in our lives. But I do think that those medieval images represent something very real that people felt and that I think we feel too. When people imagined the devil, they were responding to this feeling, this sense that there was some force out there that just seemed to foil and thwart their best attempts at being good people. They felt in a way that they couldn't quite place, like there was something out there that was conspiring rather creatively to thwart love and justice and beauty at every turn. And I think that's probably what Jesus experienced in this temptation in the wilderness. Not so much a visitation from some mysterious being, but a visitation from that all too familiar whisper. Have you ever heard that whisper? Like the one that Christ heard in the wilderness? The whisper that says to you, "Oh, what's the harm? Everyone else is doing it." The whisper that says, "If you tell the truth, there's going to be nothing but trouble. A little lie would be better for everyone now." Or perhaps you, like me, have lived with the dizzying contradiction of caring about the earth even as you pollute it. Or you have, like me, wished that your coffee and your clothing came from sources that didn't exploit people, but not quite enough to change where you shop. Almost as if there was some little voice whispering in your ear saying, "Oh, come on. One person can't really make a difference." I don't know about you, but I often feel like all of my best efforts to be a better follower of Christ in the world, all of my efforts to show love and justice to my neighbors, to care for God's earth, all of them feel like they are resisted by something that I can't quite place. I don't think it's a fallen angel with horns. It's something that feels almost like gravity. Like this steady and persistent pull that holds me down and holds me back, and I don't even really notice it until I'm trying to escape. And when I look at the world, I realize that this is not just an individual phenomenon, it's social too. Think about the way that the world, at best, sort of lurches toward peace and justice for all people, but think of all the setbacks, the delays. I think as an example about the legacy of racism and white supremacy in our country, from slavery to segregation to mass incarceration, we seem to confront again and again the particular forms and institutions in which racism is rearing its head at every moment. We struggle, we work together, and sometimes we make progress and we overcome, and yet it feels like for all of the advances and all of the successes, there is still some force bigger than any one of those institutions or the attitude of any individual that is just pulling back against us every step of the way. It's like a whisper. It whispers to me. It tells me that as long as I'm okay, I could afford to ignore what's happening to others. Maybe not forever, but it's a busy week. And I'm here to confess to you that too often I listen. I listen to those whispers. I'm not here to tell you that there's some evil force lurking in the shadows. I'm not going to send you home to check for demons under your bed or in your closets. But I do think we would be foolish to dismiss the whole idea out of hand just because it seems a little superstitious. I think it would be foolish to accept the idea that the only organized force in the universe is toward good, because I think experience tells us something quite the opposite. And I think that's what Scripture is warning us about through this story, warning us about those whispers. And lucky for us, Scripture offers us more than a warning, but also a guide, a way to respond, because we can see how it is that Christ resists the whispers, resists the temptations. He doesn't get in an argument with them. He simply stands firm in his own identity. He knows who he is, and he knows that God is the only one that he will obey. He knows that he is God's beloved. He knows what he's destined for. He knows what he needs to do. And by being clear about all of that and refusing to compromise, he is able to stand firm against the tempter's whispers. And all that goes for you, too. You are a beloved child of God. You are made in God's image, and God called you good. You are beautiful the way you are, no matter what the whispers might say. You owe obedience to God alone, not anyone or anything else, no matter who tries to convince you. There is no reason in the world good enough to do the things you know you shouldn't do, no matter how convincing the whispers are. And what you do and how you live in this world does matter, no matter what the whispers might try to convince you of. So all you have to do is be like Jesus. All you have to do is be like Jesus when the tempter came whispering to him in the wilderness. He stood in his identity. He knew who he was. So all you have to do is what Jesus did. Call the devil a liar and tell him you know better. It's easier said than done, of course. I think that's the last line of most of my sermons. But the truth is, this faith stuff always is easier said than done. I don't stand before you beckoning you toward the finish line. I'm running this race right alongside you. It's easier said than done. This faith stuff, it always is. But it's possible. It's possible. There is one more thing. This little line at the end of the story, it's almost an afterthought. Did you catch it? After Jesus resists the third temptation, the text says, "Then the devil left him alone, and the angels cared for him." Then the devil left him alone, and the angels cared for him. Take it as another reminder that God does not exist to shield us from pain, and yet God will always help us endure it. The devil left him alone, and the angels took care of him. It's a good reminder that evil can scurry around in the shadows and whisper all it wants. But we've got God with us, a bright light and a mighty voice.